I was in the car on Saturday and Sarah asked me if I'd like to listen to a podcast about the possible introduction of a universal basic wage. It was from a book called Utopia for Realists by Rutger Bregman, and I was kind of interested, but really the experience taught me a couple of things. Firstly, we need to be aware of our assumptions. Secondly, we need to be aware of the lessons of history. And thirdly, that stories can change people's minds. Because when I heard about a universal basic wage, I really thought, well, that's never going to happen, based on my assumptions. But then I heard that in the 1960s, in 1968, 5 of the leading economists in the US wrote a letter to Congress. And the letter to Congress was saying that we need to fulfill our responsibilities. It's entirely feasible to introduce a universal basic wage so that nobody lives in poverty. Anyone below the poverty line just gets cash to take them up to so that they're not living below the poverty line. That letter was signed by 1,200 other economists. Kind of blew my mind when I heard that. And then that was the time of Nixon being in power, and Nixon heard this message, and in 1969 he proposed a modest basic income so that nobody lived below the poverty line, which kind of surprised me because Nixon is he was a Republican and not the sort of politician that I associate with caring about the masses. Something that you'd expect the Democrats to be supporting. In 1970, that piece of legislation went to Congress and it passed Congress. And not just in a small way, 254 votes to 155. It was like overwhelming support for this bill. But the bill to introduce a universal basic wage was stopped in the Senate. And the reason it was stopped in the Senate was because the Democrats believed that it was inevitable. It was inevitable that that a universal basic wage would eventually be introduced. And so what they were doing was that they were just holding out for a better baseline. Now, the legislation didn't pass Congress, and then in 1972, so about a year later, another piece of legislation was put through. It went through Congress again. Again, the Democrats stopped it because they wanted a higher baseline. They wanted people to get the poverty line to be higher. It kind of sputtered on for another few years until the idea fell flat, I guess, in 1978, because there was a whole bunch of experiments that were going on around the world around providing a universal basic wage, a minimum level of income so nobody was below the poverty line. Finland, England, India, South America, there were 4 major experiments in the US, and they were all demonstrated that by every measure this system was a success, including the fact that it was financially self-sustaining, in that the benefits more than paid for the costs. But one of the pieces of analysis from the experiment in Seattle showed that the divorce rate amongst the people who were receiving this free cash had increased by 50%. And this spooked everybody, including the Republicans, and the idea was kind of dropped. And today, I hadn't even heard of this concept of a universal basic wage because it was so beyond my assumptions. One of the interesting things, though, is that about 10 years after that Seattle data was released, which basically torpedoed the idea of passing legislation about a universal basic wage, analysis was done of that analysis, and it was found to be a statistical error. There was no increase in the divorce rates. So, except for a really strange, like a little twist, a universal basic income could be a reality today. It was so close to happening, and yet most of us have never heard of it. So that car trip taught me that I was basing my worldviews on the assumption that poverty was a lack of character, and that we needed to put in systems and controls to deal with that lack of character. But poverty isn't a lack of character, it's simply a lack of cash. And when I adopt that as my assumption, anything becomes possible. So that story changed my mind. Thanks for listening.